staff physician at one of the nonprofit methadone treatment centers in town in Cleveland. And I'm also, maybe more importantly for this presentation, on the faculty of the family medicine residency at UHCMC. So we see a lot of people who need to be screened and diagnosed. And for that reason, I've taken this presentation, which is, I'm going to screen share. I hope right there. Let's see. Yeah. So you should be able to see my presentation. And I'm just gonna play around a little bit and get rid of all my things in the way. Okay. So I've called this presentation Diagnosis of Alcohol Use Disorder, What's Old and What's New. And if we just wanted to talk about what's practical, we could just have one slide and we'd have the 11 criteria for alcohol use disorder that are presented in the DSM-5, and we would just use that. But I figured for this presentation and looking at who's in the group today, there are some of you that probably use that every day and have it memorized. Others may not use it as much. And so I wanted to back up a little bit and talk a little bit more about what this diagnosis is, how it has been constructed over time, and how we interact with it in different ways. So we will meet up with the DSM-5 criteria, but I'm going to take you on a little bit of a trip around the diagnosis to start with. Here are some objectives. I hope this will happen. We'll just review a little bit the pharmacology of alcohol and the prevalence of alcohol use disorder. I'm going to talk about some things that I didn't necessarily know a lot about, historical influences on this diagnosis. And you can, in your feedback, say whether this is something interesting or relevant or, just a kind of a rabbit hole. We'll talk a little bit about the difference between screening and diagnostic tools and the use of the screeners, the AUD SUD, the single question screener, the audit, and how using those compares with using those DSM-5 criteria, which are diagnostic. And then we'll have a little speculation about where this is going in the future. So I hope for those to whom diagnosing alcohol use disorder is your, bread and butter, that you'll find at least one thing that captures your interest. Alcohol use disorder relies on alcohol, and so this is a quick review of what it is and why we have alcohol use disorder, or why it's been a problematic substance. So you could see that alcohol is this molecule. It's formed when oxygen and hydrogen atoms bond with an atom of carbon, and you could see that there's a whole range of alcohols. There's not just one alcohol. How we use the word alcohol is really as a substitute for a small molecule alcohol called ethanol, and it has this formula, C2H6O. There's a diagram of it. Why has it persisted over time, since we have evidence of alcohol being in the environment and in human use for many, many centuries? Well, in addition to being an intoxicant and a substance that a person can get addicted to, okay, I think John, is our muting problem fixed?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. So ethanol is used as an anesthetic, an antiseptic, an antidote to methanol poisoning, and a solvent. It's also used as a fuel, and it can be used as a livestock feed. So even if we had a substitute intoxicant, we're probably always going to have ethanol in our lives because of all of these different uses that it has. But the reason there's alcohol use disorder is that it is like other substances that can induce a use disorder, and in that it affects the central nervous system and especially the reward system for people who are vulnerable to that. So this is like a big mouthful, that it acts as a depressant by increasing inhibitory neurotransmission, decreasing excitatory neurotransmission, and through a combination of both of these in multiple pathways at the same time. So it affects dopamine, serotonin, GABA, and glutamate pathways. So, when you think about why people like to drink or have a drink, you could think about the variety of ways that effects on these pathways might translate to a person.
I think you may put on speaker. Just
Here, can everybody mute, please?
Yeah, we're okay, I think. You can think about all the different ways alcohol may affect a person, and through these four pathways. But we know that for people who develop an alcohol use disorder, those are those people who have that hyper developed, revved up reward system, and mostly the satisfying and rewarding effects are going to go through that dopaminergic pathway. There has been recent attention to alcohol as a group 1 carcinogen that causes several types of cancer. And the big report in the Lancet from July 2023 got a lot of popular press. That's that study that ended up concluding that, contrary to what we had said before or now, there's really no healthy or safe level of alcohol consumption. It ends up saying, very flatly that that all alcohol use is subjects people to health risks. So that's a kind of an adjustment to the way that we've thought of alcohol, at least over the last couple of decades, as something that can be potentially healthy or at least health neutral. That gentleman in the corner is Benjamin Rush, who made a lot of medical innovations. But one of the things he did was to really be the first person to formally describe this this situation that he says was, affected certain people that had been his patients, an uncontrollable, overwhelming, and irresistible desire to consume alcohol. This is our first formal description of alcohol use disorder in 1784. A little bit later down the line, there was interest in predictable outcomes of this excessive alcohol drinking. So, description of delirium tremens, which, Chris, or someone, you can tell me. I know that there's we've replaced that terminology, but that was in 1813 what they called that predictable syndrome that happened to people who were drinking to excess and stopped drinking. Magnus Huss was another physician in about 50 years later who coined the term alcoholism. That was his description of this state of irresistible desire to drink and the consequences of that. Out of those early medical writings and philosophizing, since we didn't have a lot of mechanisms for really testing whether our stream of thought was valid or not, there are these two streams of thought that emerged, and you can think about conversations you've had with patients, families, treatment providers about alcohol use disorder. And I think my conclusion is that these two streams of thought are actually still active. The one is that any person who, through a moral failing or for some other reason, consumes too much alcohol is going to suffer from alcohol-related problems and can develop alcoholism. The other strain of thought, which derives more from Rush, is that this is a state that affects certain specifically vulnerable people primarily, and is not a state that happens to everyone that uses alcohol. So you could think that this might be more concurrent with our modern thought. The problem for that second strain of thought is there really wasn't a good sense of why this happened to certain people. So I want to bring your attention to this theory of degenerationism. An old model that predates Darwin and that takes its concepts from a kind of pioneer French biologist named Lamarck. So this is how Rush and others explain why do some people get into this horrible trouble with alcohol, and why does this problem cluster in families? So even though this is a theory that once Darwin with his natural selection theory came along, where there actually was some good evidence and science to support that, this whole kind of Lamarckian way of thinking of things went out of favor. But if you think about our disease model, there are still elements of this degenerationism idea that can crop up. This is the theory that biological factors or toxic environmental influences or moral vices, character and personality issues, can trigger this cascade of social, moral, and medical problems due to alcohol intake that increase in each generation and finally lead to a point where the family can no longer sustain itself and it just extinguishes itself. So that's degenerationism, and it was the way that people explained why people drank and why there were these clusters in family groups and why consequences occurred. So this does seem, kind of silly or not in accordance with science. Lamarck has a big treatise, and if you get bored with hearing me, you could just Google his pictures of the giraffe, that over the generations, he says, the giraffe has to reach up to the leaves, it stretches its neck, the neck expands a little bit. The next generation of giraffes has this longer neck and has to still stretch up and get the leaves, so then their neck gets longer. And then finally, when the giraffe gets a long enough neck after several generations that it can reach the leaves easily, it doesn't have any reason to have to change anymore. You could think this doesn't really make any sense, but I will say that when we read about epigenetics, and I hope we'll have a session on the epigenetics of substance use disorder at some point, when you think about how adverse childhood experiences can have an effect on the genome, you do think that even though the science wasn't there, there was some kind of idea of stress and disease having an impact on the next generation that had some validity. So that's degenerationism, and it really was the sort of explanation of why certain people were affected more by drinking alcohol than others, and why that problem clustered. Across the next 100 years or so, there remained this idea that alcohol was a substance that could be toxic and could lead to physical and social and other kinds of consequences for particular people. But it wasn't until the 1950s that the AMA, that was the big sort of cataloger of what were considered legitimate medical problems, had a formal diagnosis of alcoholism that we would today call alcohol use disorder. started to work with other medical organizations to get a kind of a common vocabulary and a common understanding. But it really wasn't until the 1980s and 90s that there was some official modern writing about alcohol use disorder. Now, you might think that it was scientific progress and everything that led us to this point, but in fact, I was surprised to find that when this diagnosis got formalized, there were other forces afoot, and the major one was that there was money involved in whether we had a formal diagnosis of alcohol use disorder involved for us or not. In the 1980s, when we started to have changes to how medical care was paid for, third-party reimbursers wouldn't pay for assessment and treatment for a person affected by use of alcohol because there wasn't a disease category that we could code and claim that we were treating. So the AMA got together with some other influential organizations and came out with a statement that the AMA endorses the proposition that drug dependencies, including alcoholism, are diseases and that their treatment is a legitimate part of medical practice. So this was a great step forward, but interestingly, it really wasn't made, to benefit the patients. It was made so that we could get reimbursement and continue to provide care for those patients. An important step too was that the AMA endorsed that alcoholism belonged both in the psychiatric and the medical sections, which was kind of forward-looking at the time, so that there wasn't going to be a need to prove that the person was psychiatrically ill or to prove that they had other medical disease beyond their alcohol use disorder. So that's a little bit about the history of the diagnosis, and you can see that over time it has remained fairly stable. So even if you use Rush's old idea about people having an irresistible urge to drink and developing consequences and still not being able to stop drinking, if we use that as our guide, then these next couple of slides just look at how is that alcohol use disorder playing out right now in real time. This material is all from SAMHSA, and it's in the references if you need to get it. And you can see just by glancing at it that if you're looking at what's the substance in the United States that people age 12 and older are most likely to use, it's alcohol. By far, if you look at those other substances that we work with and deal with and that have a use disorder connected to them, millions of people is pretty significant. But when you look at alcohol users versus users of other drugs and other substances that can be intoxicating, it is by far our go-to substance still at this time. You can see marijuana is kind of coming up from behind, and maybe in years to come with legal changes, we're going to see more marijuana and less alcohol. This is a trend to watch. This is just about use. It's not about use disorder. This is a picture of use disorder. If you take all of those people who identify as an alcohol user, someone who ever uses alcohol, and look at how many of those are people that we could define as having an alcohol use disorder, what we see is that 45% of alcohol users meet criteria for binge alcohol use. That means 5 drinks or more for men, 4 drinks or more for the women on the same occasion, on at least one day in the past 30 days. That's that light blue ring there. And of those binge alcohol users, the red circle in the middle are those people who distinguish themselves by having this binge pattern repeatedly on 5 or more days in the past 30 days. So those are the people who are designated by SAMHSA in this study as heavy alcohol users. All heavy alcohol users have this binge pattern. Not all binge users are heavy alcohol users. And you can think about that, person in college that occasionally has too much to drink and then has hungover, and then they say they learned their lesson. And when their life changes and they're in the employment world, they never have a binge again. So you could see that there's this kind of potential progression, but that the number of people out of all of the population that would define themselves as alcohol users that have this heavy alcohol use, and we're going to see that's where our patients with substance use disorder is about 12% of alcohol users. The third thing that comes from this SAMHSA survey is looking at who is identified as having a substance use disorder. And there we can see that in a survey of the general population, that's the gray circle there, 16.5% of people surveyed met criteria for substance use disorder. That seems like it's more than it used to be. And we see that alcohol use disorder is the most prevalent use disorder, even though we may hear more or find other use disorders to be more challenging or compelling because they develop faster and their consequences are more severe or irreversible. So that would be like opioid use disorder. But you could see what they're calling heroin use disorder really makes up a pretty small segment of substance use disorder in the United States. And alcohol use disorder is by far the more prevalent disorder. So when you see italics in the slides, this is my my own thought here. What I would say about our roles in alcohol use disorder is that we do have different roles, and that that for some of us, our job is to really be at that general population level where we're screening and we're looking for unhealthy drinking, and we're motivating patients that we identify to either keep or change to a healthy pattern of drinking or a healthier pattern of drinking, and to seek a confirmation of that diagnosis, and then to refer to treatment. You can see the acronym SBIRT here, Screening, Brief Intervention, Referral to Treatment. That's what I do in my role as a family doctor. For others of us on this call, I know that our main job, or your main job, is to really confirm that diagnosis of alcohol use disorder, and then to get patients engaged in evidence-based treatment for that disorder. For some of us, we'll have both roles and go back and forth. And for others, we don't have either role, but we have a different role in getting people in the general population identified when they're one of those people that may have that irresistible urge to drink and the consequences of that, and we may have a different role in that process. So take a moment and think, what's your role in the diagnosis of alcohol use disorder? Are you someone who would be more engaged in screening? Are you someone who would be more engaged in making a firm diagnosis and referring for treatment? And if you say, well, I don't know what I'm supposed to do, I think the next slides that talk about what screening is for and what diagnosis is for will help you to clarify that. So I'm talking about screening because screening has been a focus, and it's pretty accessible and part of the JACHO mandate for hospitals. So it's hard to talk about diagnosing without first talking about screening. You could see the difference between a screening and diagnostic test. The screening test detects early disease or risk factors for disease in a large number of apparently healthy individuals. That would be that gray circle we saw of everybody that has a drink now and then, but doesn't necessarily have alcohol use disorder, or they may. Screening is meant to find those people who may have a diagnosis. The purpose of a diagnostic test is to establish the presence or absence of disease as a basis for treatment decisions in people who already are showing symptoms, or in people who have screened positive in a screening test. So when you think about a confirmatory test, you're talking about a diagnostic test there. Here is a table which is full of small writing, and I just put it in there for your reference, but it contrasts screening tests and diagnostic tests. And it tells us about screening tests. They're simple, they're easily acceptable by the patient and the staff having to do the screening, whereas a diagnostic test is more detailed. It may take more commitment from the patient and from the person providing the test, because it's really meant to provide a firm diagnosis and a stage of diagnosis, and that takes some extra work to do that. So if you think about things statistically, drag up your, statistics 101, you can think that screening tests are highly sensitive, so that they bring in a lot of people who could potentially have a problem, even if they don't, and they are a kind of excluded with more detailed screening or an attempt to diagnose them. Whereas diagnostic tests are highly specific, so that if a person has a negative result on a diagnostic test, this is likely to be true, that they don't have the disease or the disorder. Just keeping an eye on the time, because I want to go about another 5 minutes. I have a case if nobody else has a case, but if we have our case from someone, John, you can decide what we should do about that.
Well, we're going to allow time for some question and answer as well.
Yeah. So I think now we're getting into this sort of familiar territory of what are these screening and diagnostic tests that we use when we're trying to make some assessment of alcohol use disorder. And you could see the single question screener, the AUD SUD, the audit, and the MAST and the GMAST. These are older tests, but they're still good to know about, especially the GMAST, because it's meant for geriatric patients. But those are our screening tests. And then here's our diagnostic criteria that the general consensus, I think, for us, and someone can put in the chat if there's a different diagnostic tool that you use, but the DSM-5 criteria are generally thought to be the kind of gold standard for diagnosis. So here's the single question screener. It tells you about, is the person drinking excessive or high amounts of alcohol that we know will be associated with consequences. The audit is that 10-question questionnaire, which I'm going to show you in a moment. And the audit 3 are the first 3 questions that focus on drinking patterns and are trying to answer that question. Is this person a heavy drinker or not? So this is the validated single question screener. It's built into a lot of EMRs these days. And it's how many times in the past year have you had 5 or more drinks in a day if you're a man, 4 or more if you're a woman. So you can see it's getting at, are you a person who has had that experience of binge or excessive drinking? And any response that's not 0 triggers more screening. This is the audit C. You can see it's a little more complex. The first 3 questions of the audit: how often did you have a drink containing alcohol in the past year? How many drinks containing alcohol did you have on a typical day when you were drinking? How often have you had 6 or more drinks on one occasion in the past year? So you could see it focuses again on, is this a person who's had binge drinking and repeated excessive drinking? And you could see you don't have to score very high to get a positive on the audit C. And that tells us that we want that person to be able to move on to yet more screening or a discussion about a diagnosis. This is what the audit looks like. You can easily find it on your phone or in the EMR that you use, and you should just kind of find a form to use that that's easy for you. These are this is the self-report version and an interview version. You could see it's pretty complicated for a screening tool because you have to use all of these different scales. So it's a commitment to use this screen, and questions come up about, well, you know, what should we do? We have 1 question, 3 questions, and 10 questions. What's better? So it's a little surprising when you see how do these compare. What we ended up saying about the audit C and the single question screener is that the single question is actually more sensitive. It brings in more people, and it's a little less specific for finding unhealthy alcohol use. The audit C is sensitive enough that it's not going to miss people that might have a problem that needs to have more investigation. But it's a little more specific. It cuts out more people that probably don't have a problem. So they kind of both win in their different ways. Personally, I use the single question screener. It's in our EMR. And if the person says, oh, 0, I would never drink that much, you know, I can't drink more than 2 without feeling like I need to stop, then you're done with that person. You don't need to continue with them. It's brief, and you can screen a lot of people out from the general population with that question. And that frequency of drinking question in the audit C does tend to bring in some people that turn out not really to have a problem. So I prefer the single question screen as a starting point. But for both of them, they're highly sensitive. So you could pick the one that you want to use. Sometimes people like the audit C because if a person answers positive, your EMR will just feed you the other questions of the audit. So here is the next question is, well, can I just use the audit C, or do I need to go on to the audit? What's best at detecting high risk use in someone who's getting a positive single question screener? You can see here that from this study by Bush comparing the two, that the audit C or the audit would both work for detecting high risk use, heavy drinking, or alcohol dependence. So either one of those can be your way to do that. And so you could see that for people before the person is entering a kind of a treatment sphere, you can have several routes to getting to decide if that person needs to go on to a more diagnostic phase. And you could start with a single question screener, the audit 3, continue to the complete audit, or stop with the audit 3 and continue on to refer that person to do some more complex diagnostic testing and evaluation. I'm going to just put in a plug for the complete audit. When you think about questions 4 to 10 and what they get the patient to reflect on, it's about, if they've been unable to stop drinking, if they failed to do things they were supposed to, if they felt guilt or remorse, if they've blacked out, if someone's been injured because of their drinking. So these questions I think, have some value to them that's more than just the number that, they score. It's that they focus on the frequency of these things happening, not on the thing itself or on, whether it's how severe it is or whether, one of these things is worse than the other. It's just about how often does it happen. And people tend to find that pretty non-stigmatizing to answer those questions. But the person gets to hear their own story of what's happened to them as a result of their drinking. And, for a different day, we'll talk more about motivational interviewing and how the audit really supports the principles of motivational interviewing that get people to make a change in their behavior. So about diagnosis, and I'm going to conclude with this, that we know that we've been diagnosing alcohol use disorder way before Rush, just by observation. And observation is specific, but it's not sensitive. Here's an example of observation. Someone, probably the significant other or parent of this person, is imploring the person, don't do what you usually do. Don't make yourself helpless by drinking in the beer shop. Stuff will come out of your mouth that you will regret later. And you may fall down and hurt yourself and have some physical consequences of your drinking. You've alienated all your friends. Nobody's going to help you. You are now labeled the town drunkard. If you tried to screen this person, they would likely screen positive on all the screeners that we've talked about. There's no sense of frequency, but when people are labeled a drunker, a drunk, a degenerate, which relates right back to that old philosophy of degenerationism, when you see that label, you know that that's a person who's engaged in these behaviors frequently. This is a diagnostic. This is an observational diagnosis. When you look at the DSM-5 criteria, you really see those observations built into an instrument that has validity and that will give you a kind of a consistent result when you are looking from person to person, that you can rely on your conclusions that you make from asking these 11 questions. You can see that the questions group into 3 themes: loss of control, repeated use despite negative outcomes, and then medical and pathophysiologic complications. And the scoring is pretty simple.
All right, I think you're muted.
Oh, I think I just flipped out, but can you hear me okay?
Yes, yes, we can.
All right. So you can see it's pretty simple to score, and the DSM-5 criteria actually look easier to use than the screening tools. The reason for that is that when we're using DSM-5 criteria, we're trying to make a diagnosis for a person who already has a positive screen or who is obviously symptomatic. So the group that we're looking at is a much narrower group than that group that we're using those screening tools with. So I think the upshot there is that if we really want to use these tools as they're intended, we're screening first. And for people with a positive screen or who can bypass screening because they're already symptomatic, that's when we want to use the DSM-5 criteria. So I will conclude by saying there are those questions. Here's something that Kay sent me, and I found the paper that supports it. It's a way for people to use the DSM-5 criteria to score themselves and decide if they have an alcohol use disorder or not. And this is the details of that study if anyone would like to look at them. Here's a little bit about modern trends here that over the pandemic, younger people are drinking less, older people didn't change as much. So it just leaves us to conclude with, what are our future directions here? I'm going to stop sharing, I hope. One